Good evening and welcome to the Somerville Community Preservation Committee hearing on revisions to the Community Preservation Plan. I'm Dick Bauer, I'm the chair of the committee, and I'm here as the designee of the Historic Preservation Commission, where I'm also the chair. I want to start by welcoming you all here and by introducing the other members of the committee. I will pass the mic down.
Hi, I'm Ezra Glenn. I'm a general public member of the committee.
Uma Murugan, general public member.
Jim McCallum.
Hi, Arn Franzen. I'm the city appointee from the Parks and Open Space Program.
Hi, I'm Liz Duclos-Orsello. I'm a general public member.
Thanks. And now I want to introduce the Community Preservation Act manager, Kristen Stelgis.
Hello, thank you all for coming tonight. A few logistics before we begin. If you are visiting, if you've come here and would like to give testimony as a community member, please make sure you sign in on the green sheet. And hopefully everyone has already signed in on the white sheet. There's also documents on the table that tell you more about our CPA program. And I'm just going to give a brief overview of what CPA is and what it has been used to fund to date. So the Community Preservation Act is a Massachusetts state law. 172 communities have adopted it. We adopted it in 2012, so this is our 5th anniversary, which we're very excited about. And what the act does is allow us to create a fund to support projects in open space, affordable housing, historic preservation, and recreation. And there are 3 main sources of funding for this work. The first is a surcharge on real estate property tax. In Somerville, that's 1.5%. These funds get matched by the state in part, and the city can make an optional appropriation each year. The enabling legislation tells us what we can and cannot spend our funds on. So the enabling legislation establishes the 4 funding categories, and the funding is primarily designed for capital improvements, projects to acquire resources in these areas, land for open space, affordable housing, and to rehabilitate and restore projects and properties in these areas. We cannot use CPA funds to pay for maintenance or replace current spending by the city. We can also not use CPA money to pay for educational activities or programming. So the state tells us we must spend at least a minimum of 10% of our revenue each year in each of these categories. One of the main functions of the hearing tonight is to get input from the community on how these allocations should be shifted based on the needs here in Somerville. To date, the Community Preservation Committee has raised these minimums across the board. So rather than spending 10% as a minimum, 15% is spent as a minimum each in open space and recreation, which is combined into one category. Historic preservation. Affordable housing gets a minimum of 45%, and administrative gets a maximum of 5%. So this goes to pay the salary of the manager and other activities that support the functioning of the program. The remainder of the funds, which is 20%, goes into the flexible category. So these are funds that can be used to support any of the projects in open space, recreation, historic, or affordable housing based on the demand that comes in from applications. So you can see that's why these numbers in this chart are higher than the minimums, because the flexible money is going to support the excess demand in these projects. So to date, if you don't consider the $2.5 million bond that was approved for West Branch Library, because none of that money has been spent yet, we have spent 51% of funds to date in affordable housing, 28% in historic resources, and 21% in open space and recreation land. We anticipate that in this fiscal year that we're starting on July 1st, so for our next funding round, we'll have just under $2 million available in new project funding. If we were to only allocate the minimum per each category, that would be $198,449 per category, with the remainder going into the flexible category, which would then go to meet demand. So what those percentages translate to in terms of projects is 10 affordable housing projects have been funded for just under $5 million, 15 historic projects just under $3 million. That goes up to 5.4 if you include the bonds. 17 open space and recreation land projects, which is just under 1.7. In total for 42 projects, which including the bond is goes up to $12 million in total. So the funding decisions are made by recommendations from the Community Preservation Committee. They are a 9-member body, so if you have met some of them, 5 of them are from relevant commissions and 4 are at-large general public members. We are recruiting a new general public member, so if you or anyone you know might be interested in applying, please encourage them to do so. The application deadline is August 3rd. There is an annual application process which will begin as soon as we finish the community preservation plan, because that's how we communicate the priorities that we are asking people to respond to in their applications. The Community Preservation Committee has designated the Somerville Affordable Housing Trust Fund as the housing arm of the committee. So the Affordable Housing Trust Fund manages a separate application process, and they make the decisions about which specific projects to fund. And then all of this is guided by the annual community preservation plan, which we're here to get input on tonight. So this is quite small, but wanted to give you a sense of what this actually means in terms of how the funding is meeting demand. And what we have found is that it's actually the case that the CPC has been able to fund the projects that were well enough developed that they were ready to receive funding and were worthy of funding. So if we look at the data, most of the projects that don't move on to the application phase, it was kind of through their own choosing. They just didn't have the time to submit the application, or in the majority of the cases, it was a project that people wanted funding for but didn't have approval of the owner, so they had to back out. But for example, in this last year, although we're still considering 3 projects in the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, 59% of projects have received funding. Although those 3 get funded, it'll go up by quite a bit. 46% of the community eligibility determination forms got funded. 54% of the applications got funded. Those numbers will go up to about match the cities, which was 71% of eligibility determination forms, and if you made it to the application phase, it would be 83%. If all of those 3 projects are funded, and then 100% of the joint applications, which are joint between the city and a community organization, were funded, and that's pretty typical across the years. So I just want to go over quickly what the priorities are currently in the plan. So if you have had a chance to read the draft plan online, these priorities are being continued, but I'll highlight a couple of exceptions. There are 2 overall priorities set by the committee. One is that the projects are consistent with community values. So this includes improving accessibility, incorporating sustainability, have broad support, are consistent with our current planning documents like Summer Vision, our blended projects, and a proposed new addition, which I know the committee would appreciate your input on, is that they want to prioritize projects that support Somerville's diversity, including support to immigrants regardless of their status. The second high-level priority is that the CPC seeks to fund projects that use CPA funding strategically. So they leverage funding, they address longstanding issues, they take advantage of opportunities, they can be a catalyst for change, and an area where they're seeking input is how they should prioritize and consider projects that are going to need funding over multiple years. And so you can comment on that in the written sign up to give testimony tonight. You can give comments on our write-in sheets on the wall. We're also having a written comment period that's open until July 20th. There's also priorities under each of the 3 categories. In open space and recreation, this includes support for acquisition of new open space, expanding access to the Mystic and the Alewife Brook, improving the health of our wetlands, rehabilitating our existing recreational land according to need, and expanding urban agriculture, such as community gardens. In community housing, now again, these projects are considered by the Somerville Affordable Housing Trust Fund. The goals and priorities are to provide affordability and perpetuity, preserve our expiring units, support mixed use and transit-oriented development, and prevent homelessness. And finally, for historic resources, these priorities are going to be shaped by the Historic Preservation Plan, which is currently under development. Right now, the guiding principle is that the CPC will seek to support projects that are at risk of being lost because they are not currently in good condition. So again, you'll have an opportunity to comment throughout the evening, but if you still have more to say or realize there's something else you want to say or have a friend or colleague who would like to give comment, we are accepting written comments on the plan through noon on Thursday, July 20th. They can be sent to my email address here, which I also have my card on the table, or by snail mail to City Hall. And again, don't forget, we're recruiting for a general public member. Hopefully you will pass that message on as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kristen. So the format for tonight is that we're going to take a testimony in the different areas, and we've tried to make it our practice to ask different people to come each year so that we get as wide a range of perspectives as possible. So we have asked two people to come and present on behalf of the city: Melissa Woods, senior planner, to talk about the Summer Vision update, and Emily Monet, the Somerstat director, to talk about Somerville capital planning. Then after that, we've asked the Somerville Homeless Coalition to do a presentation, and Mark Alston-Follansby and Lisa Davidson are going to present. We asked the Somerville Historical Society to do a presentation, and unfortunately nobody was available, but they sent a written statement. And we've asked the Mystic River Watershed Association to present about open space, and Amber Christofferson, is going to present on that. We're going to ask you to keep your testimony to 5 to 7 minutes, and Ezra will keep time, and he'll let you know when you're getting close to that limit. And then it's possible after presentations that some members of the committee may have a few questions, but I'm going to try and keep them pretty limited so that we can move along. And then after the testimony has been taken, then we'd love to hear from the public, and so we'll take public testimony from anybody who would like to tell us your thoughts about the plan and about what we ought to be concentrating on as we do the Community Preservation Act. So first I'm going to start with Melissa Woods.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa Woods. I work in the Planning and Zoning Office, which is part of the Office of Strategic Planning and Community Development. And my office focuses on development review, long-range planning, and also historic preservation. But tonight, I'm here to give you an update on Summer Vision. That's the city's comprehensive plan. It was adopted in 2012, and we've spent a lot of time trying to track our metrics in the plan in the best way possible. And we prepared our first presentation to the Board of Aldermen for the end of the last calendar year, and we'll be giving an update to them again after July 1st. So the data you'll see in this presentation is from December 31st, up to date of December 31st of last year. So Summer Vision has several metrics in it because you want to be accountable to something. And so there's 30,000 new jobs that we anticipate in Somerville by the year 2030, 125 new acres of open space, 6,000 new housing units, of which 1,200 are deed restricted, permanently affordable. And we want 50% of new trips by sustainable modes. And if that wasn't enough, we want development in the right areas. We've heard time and time again that people want to conserve the neighborhoods of 1, 2, and 3 family homes, and they want new housing and commercial development along our main streets and in our squares and transformational areas. So we developed this tool that we call the Summer Vision Tracker. It's just a really huge spreadsheet, really. And we track how much square footage is developed, how many new units, and also the square footage of commercial development. That allows us to make sure that we are tracking jobs consistently. We also track net new housing units because occasionally units are lost in development. The residential market is strong. So sometimes you do see a 2-family convert back into a single. So we want to track that. Summer Vision cares about 1 unit of housing and 500 units of housing. And then we also track open space created by both the city and developers. So the Summer Vision Tracker, all the data reported here tonight and to the reports to the Board of Aldermen is by C of O, and that's because lots of projects come through our zoning board and planning boards, but just because it's permitted at that stage doesn't mean that it starts and finishes construction. So we want to make sure that people are able to either work or live in these buildings, and that's when they're counted and reported out. So just to hit on our Summer Vision metrics, I'll go through those quickly. We've developed 6,086 new jobs. That's mostly from Partners Healthcare. We've developed 1,135 new units of housing. You will see that we have developed more housing than we'd like in our conserve areas versus our enhance and transform areas. And of the deed-restricted affordable housing that we want to create, which is 1,200 new units, we've created 225 new units of affordable housing. And last but not least, 125 new acres of open space is our goal, and we've created 16.78 acres, the majority of that being new usable open space in Assembly Square. So one number that you won't see grow exponentially towards a metric is where development is happening. And right now, 75% of our development is happening in transformation areas, and that's due to Assembly Square and Millbrook Lofts over by Twin City Plaza. So this is how we're tracking towards our 2030 goal. For the most part, for jobs and housing, we're at about 20% towards our goal, but for open space, we are lagging behind at 13%. So what is our staff doing to try to get us closer to our Summer Vision goals and to keep moving towards those targets? The first is our zoning overhaul. All the information you need to know about our zoning, and I'd be happy to come back at a later date, is at somervillezoning.com. There's a discussion draft available at this time. The high points of the zoning overhaul is to move development out of our neighborhoods, facilitate and sometimes require commercial development depending on the neighborhood, increase our open space requirements, and maintain our existing 20% affordable housing percentage. We're going to do more long-range planning in our transformational areas like Brick Bottom and Interbelt. And then I commit to you that the Board of Aldermen report that we give to them twice a year, I'll also send to Kristen to share with your committee. And how can you help? This is my plea, is to support the zoning overhaul because that will help us get to our goals. And then focus funding on more open space. The private market, for better or for worse, does make money off developing housing and jobs, but it's not quite the same for open space. We are requiring development in transformational areas to create open space, but we need our help, and we want everyone across the city to have the same amount of access. So we need help in getting to our open space numbers. And then lastly is just to stay in touch and change your funding to reflect the progress that we've made. So thank you very much for having me.
Good, thank you. Any members of the CPC have any questions for Melissa? I think not, so we'll move on to Emily. Emily's an old friend since she was the original community preservation manager, and she was wonderful, and one of the wonderful things that she did was to hire Kristen to replace her, who's also wonderful.
Good evening. My name is Emily Monet, and I'm the director of Somerstat, and I am here to give a brief overview of the city's capital planning efforts and talk about how CPA fits into them. So the city tracks its capital investment needs in a capital investment plan project list, and the most recent version is online. It's current as of June 14th, and it covers a 10-year period from fiscal 17 to fiscal 26, and we'll be updating that shortly to push it out 1 year since we are coming up on fiscal year 18. So we categorize our CIP projects, our capital projects, we put them into 5 different categories, 5 different buckets. One are what we consider critical projects. So those are projects that are needed to fulfill Summer Vision and the Union Square neighborhood plan. This includes subsurface utility and streetscape work, a lot of it, the relocation of the existing public safety building and fire station from Union Square elsewhere, and more. There's also recurring investments. So these are investments that we have made and will continue to make on a regular basis, usually annually. So this is investments in our city fleet, in our school and city buildings, in our tree canopy, in our streets, and more. Underway projects, pretty straightforward. Those are the ones that are ongoing but not yet completed. And then pending are projects that we've identified as needing to happen in the coming years because they respond to a critical community need, address a public health or safety issue, or advance projects that are underway or critical. So we only have a few of these, but these are fields projects, primarily athletic fields projects to advance the athletic fields master plan, and also the potential demolition of the Homans building behind City Hall. And finally, unscheduled. These are community priorities and identified needs that currently have no assigned timetable. So this covers the gamut. It's water and sewer projects, it's parks, fields, streetscape, building projects, projects all across the city that are important, but we currently have no timetable for them because we have to prioritize the projects in the previous 4 categories, just due to funding constraints. So I know this is small, but the point here is that our current CIP project list, again over 10 years, the total of the projects approaches $700 million. Now, this is a little misleading because it includes the high school, which is a debt exclusion project. And so if you take out that project and the unscheduled projects, the ones that have no timetable, you get to about $374 million over 10 years. And this is funded out of the general fund, the city's main budget. It's funded out of our water and sewer enterprise funds. And then we've got a couple grants, CPAs in there, and then there are some items that we fund through pay-as-you-go, basically stabilization funds and that kind of thing. So in other words, we don't borrow for them. So if you look at this by year, you can see that, again, just looking at excluding the unscheduled and debt exclusion projects, which is the high school, you can see that the most challenging years are fiscal year 18 to fiscal year 23. And basically, this is because there's enormous infrastructure work that's needed, primarily in Union Square, to allow the transformation of the neighborhood as called for in the Union Square neighborhood plan, and also to take advantage of some very unique opportunities that we were offered as part of the Green Line extension. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it's all very expensive, and it gets more expensive every year. And it's also important to know that we're still assessing our capital needs. Somerville, like many cities across New England, has suffered from disinvestment over decades due to lack of funding, and that's impacted our water and sewer infrastructure, our streets, our buildings, our schools. So we are still in the process of assessing all of those and making sure that we know exactly what we need to do to bring them up to the level where they should be performing at. So given the current list of capital projects, we are in the process of using the debt service estimates, assuming we were to go forward with all of the critical, recurring, underway, and pending projects, to update our general fund, water enterprise fund, sewer enterprise fund, long-range plans. So particularly for the general fund, this analysis will allow us to estimate or project our budget surplus over the 10-year period. And that informs the extent to which we can invest in our unscheduled projects, if any. So I don't have that answer for you right now, but as you can tell, there's an extreme need just in those first 4 categories, and we may not have a lot of capacity in the budget in the short run, especially during those crunch years, to invest in unscheduled projects, but that is still being determined. Did you have a question? Okay, sorry, thank you. Okay, I'm almost done. So how can the CPC help? It really comes down to these unscheduled projects. As one member of our staff said, these projects are unscheduled but not unloved. They are important projects. We just have to prioritize our critical, recurring, underway, and pending projects due to funding constraints. So the CPA is an invaluable source for moving forward unscheduled projects that are in the open space, recreation, and historic fields. You guys know that, and so we appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thanks, Emily. Are there any questions from any of the committee members? Good. So let's, Ezra?
Actually had a question for Melissa. You finished quickly, and then it took me a minute to think of the question, so I'm sorry to pull you back up. Is that okay if I? Yes, please. Okay. It seemed like at the very end you sort of dropped this mini bomb of, hey, we got affordable housing taken care of by the private market, focus on open space and historic preservation. And that's somewhat new and surprising, I think, here, because we've generally felt there's a real priority of affordable housing. It seems like your numbers said the private sector is going to be building hopefully 6,000 units of housing and 1,200 will be affordable. And that'd be great. It would get us what would be permanently affordable, which would get us towards some kind of affordability. What we've talked about a lot here, and we've heard from the community, is at the same time, Somerville has something like 33,000 existing housing units, which have been sort of de facto affordable, but are not preserved, and we're losing all those. Do you have any sense of how those 1,200 new affordable housing units, if we get them, do those even start to make up for all we're losing and have lost? Or are we all set? Because to me it seems like I thought we still needed affordable housing. But.
Yeah, I could continue. I could take up another 7-minute time slot answering that question. Everything I presented to you tonight is in the lens of how we're tracking towards summer vision. There is an insane housing demand in Metro Boston, which means that in a free market, the highest payer gets housing. So there's a lot of people that are pushed out of rental housing that they can't afford anymore or can't afford to buy, or, we all know the story of, I had 1 kid, I had 2 kids, and now we don't fit and we have to go somewhere else, etc. So more affordable housing is always good. So although my plea was for more open space contribution, because that's where we're lagging behind according to Summer Vision, affordable housing is a big push of all city staff, and the community, of course, appreciates that.
Thanks, Melissa. Any other questions from committee members? In that case, let's move on to our other community partners, and we're going to start with the Somerville Homeless Coalition. So Mark and Lisa, do you want to come up?
Thank you. So first, I'm not good at public speaking, so I'm totally thrown off with the camera here. Anyways, I want to thank the city for all they're doing for affordable housing, but there's still a desperate need for affordable housing. Somerville Homeless Coalition works with a lot of low-income people that even the affordable housing units that are made available are still unaffordable for the clientele that we work with. They are on fixed incomes. They don't even meet the income max that is being required to actually be screened to be eligible for these affordable units that are being made. So Somerville is still in desperate need. When we say affordable, well, my brain automatically has to switch to a little bit of subsidized, because affordable is depends on what you make can be affordable. So when we're thinking about it, is we need more subsidized / affordable housing in the city of Somerville to keep the Somerville residents here. We work with our clients to find housing search, to find housing, and many of them are lucky enough to get a Section 8 voucher, which would add to the subsidy to maybe rent one of these affordable units. But they're full, they have wait lists, and many of our clients end up leaving the city that they've grown up in, they love, or they're unable to use their Section 8 voucher and have to return it to the housing authority and remain homeless because the rents are just too high in Somerville. So Somerville is in desperate need of affordable/subsidized housing. I'm gonna pass it off to you.
Thank you. So I think I just want to reemphasize that we had the city had a lottery when the units came available at Avalon Bay. So the city has a lottery. One of our folks, a male individual in the shelter, won the lottery, thinks he's all set for permanent housing, but he goes to Avalon Bay, and because his income is so low, he can't qualify for what you're calling affordable. So a lot of the affordable housing it's developed as fine for people who are teachers or firemen, and they all need housing as well. But for our folks at 30% and less of the average median income, they're not going to begin to qualify. And so one of the things that we talked about in places like the Sustainable Neighborhoods Committee was, the city needs to provide an additional subsidy on top of an affordable unit for people at very low income to be able to stay here. I mean, I think, we know about the number of children who are K-12 in the schools who are homeless. We see this every day that families are struggling to stay here. And the sad thing is that even with the subsidy, like Lisa said, that you can't find an apartment in Somerville that'll be eligible for something like a federal Section 8 because the rents are just too high. So the more we can do to create that housing that is truly affordable to all income levels, the better we're going to be able to keep people who want to stay in Somerville to allow them to live here. So thank you. Any questions?
I had a question. So when Kristen went through our draft plan, she mentioned that one of the things that we are thinking about was including a provision about preserving Somerville's diversity, including immigrants regardless of their legal status. Do you have any thoughts about ways that we could be thinking about that in the context of affordable housing?
Excuse me. I think it's a fantastic idea. I don't know enough about the CPA regulations on whether or not it says we can't do it. But I know federal, you can't do it. So I would, if we could make a priority for families who are undocumented or immigration status, that would be fantastic because there is a desperate need. The only housing that we're serving who have immigration roadblocks is state housing, and there's just not enough of state housing available. It's the only option that is going to be affordable for them. So, do you have any thoughts?
I think that's one category, but I think most low-income people in Somerville are all faced with the same thing, whatever their status is. And as we see displacement and gentrification in East Somerville the same way we did in West Somerville 20 years ago, it's going to be exacerbated for everybody.
The alderman passed a resolution about affordable housing, and I want to read it into the record, but then I also want to ask the two of you to respond if you would. So the alderman passed a resolution that read as follows: that the Community Preservation Committee consider allocating funds for the direct purpose of housing municipal employees. And they noted that there's some programs in the communities of Nantucket and Norfolk to do this. What if you have any thoughts about that?
No, does the city have a residency law?
No.
So you're lucky that way. But yeah, I think, everybody wants to live in Somerville. I can't afford to live in Somerville, right? So I think many people would like to live here, and how are you going to make it possible? We have to build more housing. I mean, I think you talk about those with the 60, how many units was it? some revision? 6,000. And we know it's really got to be much more than that to begin to address the need. How you prioritize those things, I think, is where it gets tricky. I mean, certainly the perception, I think, of a lot of city employees were getting into affordable housing over other folks. You see some backlash.
Were they saying we should house useful employees in Nantucket?
That would probably be even less affordable. Any other questions from committee members? Good. Thank you.
Sorry, I do have one just quick question. If you had to indicate a prioritization for need vis-a-vis AMI, I heard you say 30% and below. Is that, if you were going to make a list of who's in most need for affordable or subsidized housing, is that the threshold that you would identify? Is it a different number? Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Some of our people are low income, the majority of them are very low income, and without some kind of a subsidy, they can't afford any kind of housing at all. That's why they're homeless.
Thank you both. Our next is Historic Resources, and we invited the Somerville Historical Society to present, and although they were not able to send anybody, they sent a, oh, I'm sorry, Richard, are you here for that? Richard, great. Here for the Somerville Museum. Thank you so much.
I have a few minutes.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Do I need this?
Yeah, I think because we're recording it, so come on
Okay.
up.
I don't have any show and tell.
Just start by introducing yourself.
My name is Richard Graff. I am an architect and a project manager. I've worked with the Somerville Museum now since 2011 on an ongoing series of projects that we have been knocking off one at a time. Barbara Mangum gave me a call this morning and said that she was in the Philippines and therefore couldn't make it this evening. So she asked if I'd come in her stead and update you on what we've done to date and make a pitch of sorts for more money for very necessary ongoing projects. Really briefly summarizing, the Somerville Museum functions as a community museum. It was originally built in 1930 as the Somerville Historic Society headquarters. It's a colonial revival building which we have been constantly repairing and upgrading. To date, we have done everything on the outside pretty much that needs to be done. We've painted the windows, replaced missing trim, put on a new slate roof, painted our way all the way around the elaborate woodwork on the outside of the roof, at the edges of the roof. We've insulated the attic. We've restored all the windows, and we have painted the windows on the inside and purchased really high quality interior storm windows and installed blackout shades motorized at the upper level. We've also, in the past year and a half, hired the firm of Peter Quinn Architects to help us design a historically appropriate and permittable addition of an elevator to make the museum accessible to the handicapped, which is a mandate that we have to meet. So in the midst of doing all of this, there's one part of the museum which still needs work, and that is the archival storage area in the basement. Nobody sees that, but it's an important part of the museum. The collections of the museum are stored in that area. It includes a lockable vault that was built into the original building, which is a useful space for very precious objects, and it includes a lot of sort of random rooms. What we would like to do in the basement, and what we would like to approach the CPA for funding to assist us with, would be to consolidate the broken up floor plan into several more useful spaces for the storage of the collection, to evaluate and update the HVAC system, which was installed in the building in 1984 in the basement, to get it functioning, to get it proper. Right now, it is not really satisfactory for the control of climate that's necessary for a museum collection. And we have a collection, and some people might, look and say, "What's that?" But it's really precious Somerville memorabilia, which is stored in that basement. So what we are looking for is funding for the mold remediation in the basement, funding for off-site storage of the collection as needed. While that's going on, some things will need to be removed, and funding for the HVAC upgrades necessary for the basement. Barbara and I discussed this briefly, and the cost would be in the hundreds of thousands, probably close to $300,000 to $400,000 to get all of this done in a proper fashion to keep the museum, to make the museum function for the next, it's about 80 years old now, to function for the next decades, and to keep this precious collection of the city of Somerville that documents the history of the city of Somerville in good shape. So that's the pitch. We're looking for money to help us with the extensive renovation of the lower level, starting with mold remediation and evaluation. Questions?
Nope, I think not. So thank you so much for coming in, and particularly for pinch hitting on short notice. And now we want to ask Amber Christofferson from the Mystic River Watershed Association to come up and present about open space.
Thank you. Okay, my name is Amber Christofferson. I'm the Greenways Director at the Mystic River Watershed Association, and I approach my presentation slightly different. I'm just presenting 4 trends that I've been seeing working at a watershed scale as it relates to open space, recreation, and active transportation planning. And I'll kind of end with a few thoughts. The first is connectivity. It's something I think about a lot, and this is a map of the work that we're doing across the watershed focused on primarily the Mystic River and the Malden River all the way down to the Boston Harbor. And it's that network thinking of how each public space connects to the next public space or transit stop or neighborhood that's so important. Really, I've seen a lot of unsuccessful parks that aren't connected to the network. It's a dead end or a place that people don't travel through. So it's that kind of linear park approach that I think is really key. I don't know if you here are familiar with the Green Links program that's in the city of Boston, and that was in response to, wow, we have all these open spaces, but they don't actually connect in a way that's safe for bikes and pedestrians. So it's those green links that are almost important as the open spaces themselves. And I understand that CPA, restricts certain improvements as it relates to sidewalks, and there's some technicalities, but I would urge folks to think about that. At the same time, thinking beyond just proximity, because there is a standard of, you do a GIS analysis, are you within 5-minute walk to a park? And maybe yes, but what is that park actually doing for you, and why would you go there? And this is just from a report that the Project for Public Spaces did about what makes a great place. And part of the reason that we are taking on the work that we're taking on with the Somerville CPA grant for Blessing of the Bay Park, it's a great waterfront park that people don't know what to do with because you can't access the river there. There's no amenities. It's kind of this unknown place and thus not used. I'd also point out water as an equity issue, access to water, whether it's access to the river and boating, as well as just water features or people that can't get to a pool. So those are some considerations to think about as far as amenities in public spaces. The third is back to basics. This is an image just across the river here at McDonald Park. You can see the Route 28 bridge in the back. And for those of you that might be familiar, it was created with the aquafill from Interstate 93, dumped there in the late 70s, designed into a park, and pretty much left untouched besides some mowing and standard maintenance. So you have this, it's invasive species that have covered the river's edge. You have this feature of a bench looking out on a quote unquote river overlook that now is not the case. So it's just thinking about invasive species. Almost every park we work on, that's a huge thing to tackle. You have to think about how do you keep them removed ongoing and forever, because it's a constant issue once you get engaged. And then things like bathrooms and water fountains. There's almost no public restrooms and water fountains on the whole Mystic River, which prevents people from going to parks, especially with kids or seniors, some of the more vulnerable populations. And again, back to the active transportation and recreation, if you don't have water fountains, people don't use the amenities as much. Unfortunately, bathrooms are expensive, and it's all of these public care issues and maintenance requirements, but it is really important. And I sometimes start to think really big about parks, and then I'm like, is there a bathroom? And that's what people really want. The fourth is parks as infrastructure, and I would say this is either, you could think about infrastructure and making it an amenity at the park, or a park that also has some infrastructure benefits. And particularly as Somerville and other communities are looking to climate resiliency, there's an overlap here with flooding and heat island. You know, parks can solve both of those problems. I actually took this slide from a presentation from Weston Sampson, Sherry Ruane, who worked on Lincoln Park here. I think it's Lincoln Field in Somerville, and I was blown away by how much flood storage, you know, trees, like all of these things that this park was achieving. This is just a little axon that's showing how it's collecting stormwater, preventing flooding, planting trees, you know, all of these things that are making it a more livable and resilient place. And I'll just close with a couple thoughts, which is that public-private partnerships are key for the project we're working on. It's DCR land. You know, it's a nonprofit ourselves working on it, working with the city of Somerville, because one, for funding, and two, for ongoing maintenance. It's really important to solidify those partnerships. And public realm projects are not cheap, and they're not easy. So as far as the multi-year funding, you know, often you take on design, and then you finish up design, and then you look for capital funding. So it's a long-term investment in a space that requires not just a small amount 1 year and then you're good to go. It's an investment that you have to think about for at least 3 to 5 years, probably longer. And I think that's it. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Amber. Any questions from committee members? In that case, we're now, oh, I'm sorry. So,
I was just curious about how our friends in Parks and Open Space. I was curious about how other Mystic River connection communities are doing. Like in particular, how's the path going through Medford or other things? The Clipper Ship connection. I think there was a meeting. Was it last week?
So the Clipper Ship Connector project is a half-mile path connecting Medford Square with actually McDonald Park. This is also looking at McDonald Park. And the only thing that has really got that off the ground and going was a really robust public-private partnership, where it was ourselves, the city of Medford, DCR. We actually had funding from Wegmans and also a private foundation. So you kind of hit each of the buckets of funding. And again, that's just now for the design. We also have to be thinking about the capital and where we're going to get that funding from. But once you have the state level, the municipal level, nonprofit, private philanthropy, who all want this project to happen, you're more likely to get that capital. And at the same time, building community support that demonstrates to elected officials that people want this project. So that's just, this is the project here.
Thanks, Amber. Just quick question. So, you know, we've been struggling for a number of years to figure out our open space strategy, and we've tried to put a fair amount of money towards acquisition, you know, knowing that it's going to take a lot and we might need to sort of squirrel it away. And one of the challenges I think we have is that you have to be a little bit reactive there. You know, like you're not sure what's possible. You can't just go and buy something because you want it. You got to see what's available. One thing I think your presentation made me start to think about is this question of connectivity, where maybe we don't need to focus only on acquiring something, but just getting the access across something. So if we had 3 possible strategies, I'd just like to know your thoughts on which would be the how you would rank these three strategies. And one is acquire stuff, to own it, to preserve it, forever. Another is just get access whether or not we own it, right? To just get across sites, to connect sites. And the third would be to say, well, we have a bunch, let's maintain them and more intensively use them.
Yeah, I was thinking about the summer vision is tracking creating new open space, right? Which is really important, but when I saw that we're down on that, I'm like, but what's the qualitative underpinning of that? And it's not as easy to track with just straight numbers. So I don't know if I could, off the cuff, rank those three things. Yeah, because I haven't, frankly, my work has focused on riverfront, the riverfront. And our take, as well as the state's historic precedent, is that the waterfront belongs to the public. So it's about creating seamless access. So I guess we do deal with, now that I'm thinking this through, we do deal with creating new open spaces. And for us, it's a very network approach. And you can see here, there's lots of tiny little gaps. So do you try to get this one, and then you prioritize the gap? And it's not as straightforward here, in your case, I think, but it's also being just capitalizing on opportunities of where developers coming in and maybe pushing them to create a really nice open space that you don't have to pay for. You might have to help with maintenance and all of those things. And now you have that, and do you see a strategic link between the two? But it's, I know the Neighbor Ways program is trying to connect schools, open spaces and things, so trying to work with those bigger picture planning efforts. Yeah, but I could think more about it. I don't think, and I don't have the right answer. So.
Thanks. Any other questions from community members? So seeing none, I now want to open it for testimony by members of the public. And the first one is that we have a statement from Barbara Mangum. Kristen, do you want to read that in?
Yes, so as we heard earlier this evening, Barbara is out of the country, so she sent me a statement to be read into the record this evening. Dear Kristen, I will be out of the country when the Community Preservation Act Committee considers the subject of how to divide funds between the three areas of CPA funding next year. Could you read this into the record for me, please? Part of the reason that the CPA was created originally was to see three underfunded areas, low-income housing, land acquisition or reuse, and historic preservation, receive more and consistent financial support from the citizenry. None of these areas usually survive a fight for services in conventional municipal or town budgeting, at least not to the extent required to make a big impact. That said, we now see that in the three-way that passed into legislation, we again must defer to the immediate human need of housing. What kind of person would deny this? However, this was not the intent of the original legislation, nor the coalition of organizations that came together to see the law passed. Man cannot live by bread alone. We need open space. We need a sense of our history to remain a vibrant, thoughtful people with a vision for the future. Land acquisition costs are very high in Somerville. Preservation costs are often high for a variety of reasons. As the latter two areas have historically been underfunded, there is a backlog of projects to address. Although I do not want to say that the funds must be spent equally, as circumstances and needs may dictate otherwise, I do believe they should be brought closer to 30-30-30, with 10% for administration. When funding is available on a regular basis, organizations can dream new dreams and plan new and surprising ways to improve life in Somerville for all.
Thanks, Kristen. The next person who signed up for public testimony, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing the name, Nancy Colangelo. Come on up, please.
Hi.
Thank you so much for coming out and testifying.
Sure. I wasn't planning on saying anything, but I guess I got motivated from hearing everyone's ideas. So I was just jotting some ideas. As far as the affordable housing, I was making a connection with a group I think that's ignored in our society, in Somerville and in many places, are the mentally ill people. And I know some support that some of them have received. There's been a lot of cuts for those populations, And I'm thinking with the open space concept, wouldn't it be wonderful if there could be some park, a community kind of park, but it would be accessible perhaps to people that might have disabilities. Something on the idea, if you've seen the Menino playground by the Spalding Rehab in Charlestown, you know, it's meant for people who are maybe disabled, you know, and it's very adaptive. So I'm thinking, wouldn't it be great to use this open space idea, perhaps, and to make some accessible place where the more vulnerable of our society who have lost a lot of support and counseling and such, wouldn't it be great that they could have a place, especially if the weather was nice, that they could gather together? So, for example, I know the Somerville Mental Health Center on College Avenue was then replaced by Riverside, and you know, a lot of the clients are, you know, dispersed, and some maybe aren't even getting services now. So wouldn't it be great if there was some place, whether it's a building with some public place next to it, that they could have some support? So that's one thing I'm thinking of. The other is as far as the historical aspect, and I greatly respect the Somerville Museum and the preservation group, and Brandon Wilson, and a lot of people have done a lot of work. I'm thinking of something else that I had seen once connected to the Museum of Science, which is they have these plaques in certain places. Like one was, I think, in Saugus at some mall, and they kind of pinpointed different astrological, I forget, like, say from Saugus to the Museum of Science, like it was maybe Venus, and then the moon, you know, it showed some distance, these plaques, like distance to distance. Wouldn't it be great if we could do something with Somerville's squares, maybe the brooks, you know, river waterways, maybe our historic squares, maybe somehow to link them or to label them, or do something so there's a connection, and then people can connect to the history. It could also be old mansions, Governor Winthrop Mansion, wherever that once was, which maybe is closer to Charlestown, I can't remember. But what I'm saying, there's some very old historic homes, Tufts, you know, maybe some links there. So maybe using either the hills of Somerville, Winter Hill, and so on, or the squares, Davis to Union to Magoon, or some of the brooks like Alowife, and so, you know, each in a different way, to share a history, and so that people can connect, people could go on trips. So whether that would be open space or historic preservation or a combination, those are just some quick ideas that I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming and presenting. The next person who's signed up is Steve Mackay from the Somerville Museum. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My name is Stephen Mackay. I'm a resident of Somerville, and I work at the Chamber of Commerce, and I serve on the museum board. Years ago, I, after college, went to work at the museum, the Historical Society. And in listening to the Richard's presentation tonight, was reminded of when I first went to the museum pretty much out of college, and was involved in Carol Zelli's book, Beyond the Neck, which I think many consider as the pivotal book in terms of the history and preservation movement in the city. And I was Carol's gopher. She worked in the museum building and would express interest in finding photographs from a certain period or a certain geography, and I would run around the museum and rummage through the collection to try to bring her material that she could consider. And if you look at if you have a copy of Beyond the Neck, you see a lot of images and so forth from the Somerville Historical Society and the museum. And while that was funded by the city, a lot of the work was done at the museum. So I got to learn firsthand how a landscape historian, a professional, can make use of a collection, particularly an image collection in this instance, and saw how it leads to other things and wider involvement if you can access that, if you have a place that's can be made fairly conducive to work, a work environment, if you can preserve the collection, all of that leads to much, much bigger things. So I hope, as a, given that background and being a member of the board, that you will give it every consideration for the preservation, or helping us with the preservation in the building. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. So that was all the people who signed up to testify, but if there's anybody who would still like to testify and didn't sign up, we'd love to give you an opportunity now. So please introduce yourself first.
I'm John Reinhardt. I'm president of the board of the Mystic River Watershed Association. But more importantly, in this context, I was a conservation commissioner for 19 years. And we revised the open space plan for the first time. We took it from something that was akin to a joke to something that really looked at open space as an issue facing people and impacting their quality of life. And while I certainly agree with Amber's assessment of the importance of connectivity, because I've been working on that for a long time, I just want to emphasize very briefly that as a Somerville resident, the 3 or 4% open space is a real factor in the quality of life in the city and really should be addressed. I know it's incredibly difficult to weigh against affordable housing, but at some point, when you look at the numbers, open space is continually on the short end. So that's all I'd like to say.
One thing I do think, I believe when the numbers were presented, that was expenditures. Is that right? So there is a sort of a weird thing there that we have, what I was saying before, we tried to sort of squirrel away more money for open space. So we do have this nest egg, right, of which the downside is we haven't spent it, but we have tried. So if you looked instead, I think, at what we allocated, it would be it would be better, yes. I mean, it doesn't matter until we spend it, but just, you know, not to, it is, yes, it's in a locked box essentially, but.
Right. So we earmarked last year almost $750,000 for open space acquisition. Since we are holding it, it doesn't show up in the expenditures. We've now spent $40,000 of it for a fund so that we can do quick evaluations if a piece of open space comes along, so that we can then move on to the next step of acquiring it. But there is still over $700,000 that we have set aside for open space acquisition. That's in addition to the expenditures that you saw. Okay. Okay, good.
And I think we were hoping to keep doing
That's right. Any other questions or comments from any of the committee members? Any other members of the public want to testify? And if not, I'm going to declare this public hearing closed. Thank you all for coming tonight and presenting, and for your commitment to and your involvement in the CPA. Just want to remind people that we have sheets up, and if you want to make comments, you can put them up on the wall, as well as emailing or writing to Kristen at the addresses that she had put up earlier.